It's great to be here with you all in the Great Northwest, and I'm grateful that I think Andy and I started talking about me coming out 8 years ago, and so now finally get to be here. So I'm grateful to be here with you all. I feel like I understand Portland pretty well. I mean, I've seen several episodes of Portlandia. I've spent a lot of money at Powell's Bookstore. And today I got a glimpse of what apparently is the nudist biking club. And so I feel like I understand you all, I know you all. So that was fascinating, I must say. I was going back after lunch, and I was stopped at a red light. We don't do that in Tennessee. I was telling Farah, it's like, there's something about that I kind of appreciate. It's like, in Tennessee, we get all up in your business, and here they're like, and I'm thinking, why do you want to ride a bike naked? But if you want to, good for you. Good for you. So anyway, I'm glad to be here, grateful to be here. Whether by nature or nurture, I don't know, but I have had to deal with a great deal of conflict aversion in my life. I don't like conflict. And that's unfortunate because teaching theology in the Bible Belt is a contact sport in the Bible Belt. And I've had some crazy experiences with the way people get so worked up about religion in the South. I mean, literally, one day after I had done a lecture on inter-religious dialogue at our school, a reporter from the Tennessean, which is the main paper in the state of Tennessee, called me and said, I'm going to talk to you about your lecture today. And so I could tell she didn't quite get what I was saying, and so I spent like half an hour talking to her. And so the next morning, I thought, I should go look at the newspaper. And so I was expecting something on page B10, and I picked up the newspaper at the end of the driveway, and front page of the paper, top fold, in big letters, it said, theologian says Christians must let go beliefs to get along with Muslims. And I thought, that's not talking about me. And sure enough, first paragraph, Lipscomb theologian Lee Camp says. And I uttered a profanity. And it was really early in the morning, and I went into doing. I'll give you just a quick note of what Andy said a moment ago. I actually think that the experiences I've had, I went on to have a lot of interesting interfaith religious dialogue kind of work after this experience, because of how much anger came out, and I wanted to try to understand where all this anger come from. So I ended up having, I'm very grateful, to be on good emailing terms and been in this house twice with one of the most prominent Muslim theologians in Jerusalem, who's the chief theologian at Al-Aqsa Mosque there on the what we Christians call the Temple Mount. I'm grateful I get to know people like this and have friendships with people like that. But at the time I was like, what's going on here? So anyway, I went in to see my wife, and I said, you need to read this. And she said, she read the first part, she said, oh, Lee. And she read the middle part, she said, oh, Lee. And she got to the end, and she said, oh, Lee, you're gonna lose your job. But what I've been said in the lecture was convictions. If we believe these things and take them seriously, and yet look at our behavior, then why would anybody trust us? And what I went on to say in the lecture was, but if we really take our convictions seriously, we Christians take our convictions seriously, then it ought to make space for us to have good friendships and relationships with people who don't believe what we believe. And so I very much agree. It's not by getting rid of our convictions that we can have better relationships and disagreement. It's by finding the deepest, truest, in my belief, the deepest, truest understanding of those convictions that allows that kind of thing to happen. But, so along with this kind of religion and Bible Belt stuff, well, also for me, this kind of being Southern means you're supposed to be nice. And that Southern niceness is like, one of the most dangerous, wicked passive aggressiveness. That's just cruelty, And it's learning, and bless your hearts, and exactly right. So bless your heart's way of saying, you stupid idiot, right? But learning to speak your mind. I've got this kind of soapbox lecture I do with students sometimes about how niceness is not a Christian virtue. It's just not. Kindness is. But niceness isn't. Now there's a place for niceness. We could use a lot more niceness a lot of times in the world. So don't discard it. Do it when you can. But it's not a Christian virtue. But kindness was truth-telling and being forthright and being straightforward with people. Those are all these kind of beautiful, redemptive sorts of practices that can lead us to lots of good. Well, that's the kind of story I'll tell about my own kind of conflict aversion. My wife grew up in a household in which they never had a thought or an emotion that they didn't express. And I grew up in a household where the only emotion you're supposed to express is being happy. And for me, I would never have a sort of strong emotion that I didn't ruminate on for about 2 weeks, and then I might say something. And so one day, we're sitting in marriage counseling. It's about that. And after several months, the marriage counselor looks at us and she says, my wife's name Flora, she says, Lee, Laurie, y'all have done so much hard work. And it's like when you started this, Lee, you're over here with your conflict aversion like this and won't say anything. And Laura, you're over here with your, it's like, but you worked so hard. And she said, you started like this, and now you're like this. So you're just going to have to keep going. And so for me to talk about difference and conflict aversion, it requires a lot of me. And it's something that I've had to work on a whole lot. But somewhere along the way, when I was in seminary, we had a professor that was a beloved professor, and he used to say, talking about church dynamics, he used to say, if you're gonna have less conflict, you have to have more conflict. Right, isn't that great? Because we know what happens when you press it down or suppress it, right? Is it's gonna come out. And if you press it down and suppress it, repress it, it's gonna come out in undue ways. So our choice is, do we kind of try to find ways to lean into it and get to it and deal with it, or do we try to act like we can just press it down and then it comes out in bites? Well, here in the notion of building bridges, the statement that Andy gave us is to discover common ground for conversation without compromising convictions, which we've already found noted. Our priority is to seek understanding and build community in the midst of disagreement. Well, when I started thinking about this, I like this notion of building bridges, because if you think about the metaphor there of building bridges, think about a couple of things that might not immediately come to mind. First of all, to build a bridge assumes that there's a chasm between you and me, or between us and them, right? That's a big chasm right there that's hard to cross. And it assumes that there's a difference between two locations. You're there, and I'm here. We are not at the same place. We're just not, right? And then third, the notion of the metaphor of building bridges means it assumes that there's a lot of work that has to be done, right? Something like that just doesn't happen. Is there a lot of intense, careful, engineered, constructed, beautifully designed work? And only then can you begin to get a bridge. So, last thing about the metaphor is that the metaphor of building a bridge, and this is important, I think, it assumes that we may stick with me on this one, we may stay where we reside in our respective positions. But after the bridge is built, we have a constructive way to work together, commune together, live together with a back and forth. Right? You still may be where you were, and I still may be where I am. But now with the bridge built, We have ways to live together, work together, commune together, to have that kind of common ground, common way of facilitating life together. Now that's a pretty grandiose bridge. Maybe we think about little smaller local bridges, right? And tonight, as we think about kind of local bridges or local communities, all these same variables remain of those four things I just pointed to, is still challenging. But I want you to think about how this metaphor allows us to rethink difference of place, difference of conviction, and this helpful metaphor it gives us for mutual give and take. So tonight what I want to do is kind of give you some tools to put in your toolbox. That is, what I'm about to do for the bulk of our time together is, I hope, highly practical. We're not going to talk at a theoretical level about difference. We're not going to talk about a theoretical difference about conflict management. But instead, I'm going to give you just a lot of very practical wisdom, and I'll tell you about where I've learned some of this stuff. I'm also going to ask you to take notes, the teacher coming out of me. And so I see some of you very prepared, already taking notes, and you're already getting A's, right? So, but one of the reasons I'll ask you to take notes is because in the table talk period, I'm going to ask you to share something about whichever ones stand out to you. That is, I'm going to ask you when you do your table talk, which of these tools that we're going to talk about would have helped you at some point in your life to have better difference? That is, if you had had this one or that one, could a difference have been navigated more gracefully, or more productively, or more fruitfully if you had had this? So I'm going to give you some tools to think about building a sturdy foundation for the bridge building that needs to be done on your side. Now, a little bit about where I'm going to get some of the stuff that I'm bringing to you tonight. I'm grateful to get to be the host of a podcast called No Small Endeavor, and our tagline is exploring what it means to live a good life together. And we get to talk to a lot of amazing people. We talk to philosophers, theologians, scientists, social scientists, political scientists, and artists, poets, and so forth. And we're asking them to talk to us about their research or about their lived experience, about what they are trying to do in the world in making a life that's a life worth living, that's a meaningful life, that's a good life, that's a beautiful life. And so tonight, what I'm doing for you is I brought along some friends to you tonight, all right, by means of this. So I'm bringing you tonight 2 New York Times opinion writers. I'm bringing to you a communication professor from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm bringing to you, let's see, a woman who wrote one of the most loved and or hated books of the last decade, Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen DeMay. And I'm forgetting who the fifth one is, but they'll come up here in just a minute. And so you're going to hear from them as they kind of give us a lot of practical wisdom. The bridge building toolbox I'm going to give you is kind of fall under 4 categories: seeing, hearing, responding, and disagreeing. Seeing, let's think about seeing other people. Let's think about listening to other people and hearing other people. Let's think about how we respond. And remember that response is a very different activity than react, right? With reacting, there's not that kind of space between a stimulus and an act. If there's not space there, or very little space, that's what we call reaction, right? A stimulus happens and you react, right? A response is where you expand that space between stimulus and act, and in that space, you work with that space to choose how you're going to respond, right? And then finally, some notes on disagreeing. And I guess I'll say from the top here is that the bulk of what we're going to talk about is not about disagreeing. The bulk of what we're doing is kind of basics in human relationship. And I'm increasingly convinced that if we will increasingly try to see the people around us as human beings, that great advances can be made that way. We can make a big difference by just treating each other as human beings and learning how to respond to one another in these different sorts of ways. Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about seeing. The first person I want to share you a little bit about is David Brooks. David Brooks is a New York Times opinion writer, New York Times bestselling author, written a lot of great stuff. And he has his most recent book is called how to know a person. And to introduce this first clip from David, I want to know that my academic field I teach in college and seminary is ethics, right? And so one of the things that happens in the field of ethics is that you have a lot of big-brained, typically men, going back to the Enlightenment and forward until the 20th century, mostly kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men thinking about big abstract systems of thought, and they're trying to come up with principles, rules that everybody ought to keep, and everybody ought to do, right? And what David does in this particular interview is that he says, look, maybe rather, there's a place for rules, as he's going to say, there's a place for big abstract ideas, but maybe there's something even more basic that we ought to first pay attention to. That is, think about it this way. Rather than thinking primarily of rules and principles, think in terms of the question, what kind of person are you? What kind of person are you trying to be? And this is what ethics, prior to the Enlightenment, always tried to do. They said the most important question you can ask yourself is, who are you trying to be? Who is the person you are trying to be? What kind of person, what kind of character, what kind of disposition are you trying to have? So with that, here's our first clip from David Brooks.
Yeah, so all these male philosophers like John Stuart Mill or Immanuel Kant, they built these vast moral systems. And they're based on abstractions, like don't use someone to get someone else. Like, that's a pretty good rule, but it's pretty abstract. And it's pretty like philosophical, academic. But along comes somebody like Iris Murdoch, who's a woman and who's learning from another woman named Simone Weil, that the essential moral act is the act of attention. It's not like some fancy moral rule. It's like you're sitting in a coffee shop, you're sitting in a restaurant, you got your kid right in front of you. What kind of attention are you casting upon that person? And it's possible to cast a cold and aloof attention, in which case you're a cold and aloof person. If you cast the kind of attention which is looking for danger and threat, then you're going to find menace. But Iris Murdoch said our goal should be to cast a just and loving attention on others. Mm. So we see someone, we're going to see with the eyes of love. We're going to see with the eyes of compassion. And if we see with those eyes, we're going to call forth a different version of the person, a version that's more loving, more warm, more personal. And so the story I tell in the book is I'm in Waco, Texas, like, I don't know, it's probably like 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm having breakfast with a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And LaRue Dorsey presents herself to me as a strict disciplinarian. She'd been a teacher much of her life, and she said, I loved my students enough to discipline them. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours, a guy named Jimmy Durrell. And he comes up to our table. He knows us both. And he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders, and he shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And suddenly that stern disciplinarian that I've been talking to turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl.
Did you love that story? The strict disciplinarian turns into a bright, shining-eyed 9-year-old girl because of the way somebody cast their attention on her, right? So your first tool is to think seriously about attention and the kind of attention that you're paying to people around you. Then Iris Murdoch, as Brooks says that the essential moral act, this is a provocative claim, but I think is that it's certainly, whether it's the essential moral act or not, it's definitely pointing to something I think would help us to pay a great deal more attention to. For Iris Murdoch, the essential moral act is to cast a just and loving attention upon another person. It is worth noting, I think, as Brooks does there, that this comes from a woman, not from the men. But central to the moral life, just and loving attention. One thing that I want to note here is I've heard friends in recovery say numerous times, if you spot it, you got it. You know this phrase? So I find this helpful as we think about attention. Right? When you're paying attention to somebody else, what are you spotting? And what you're spotting may say a whole lot more about you than it does about them. Right? And it's like, well, why are you so concerned about getting the limelight? Like, well, maybe I can trip up. Or why are you so bitter and resentful? Ooh, maybe I'm the one that's bitter. And so when we start paying attention to the kind of attention that we cast upon other people, it might tell us a lot about ourselves, right? But if we want to transform the possibilities of the relationship, if we will be intentional about casting just and loving attention upon another, this might profoundly shape the kind of relationship that's possible. I love this is, I think, one of the Flemish school of painters, painting the scene from Luke chapter 7, where Jesus goes to dine with Simon the Pharisee. And in that particular chapter, there's a lot of seeing going on, but it's a seeing that's related to power and position. And in comes this woman, a sinful woman, that is washing Jesus' feet. And everyone is scandalized by the woman washing Jesus' feet, and they begin to make a fuss about it. And Jesus then uses it as a teaching opportunity. But there's this one line that I never paid attention to until a couple of years ago, where this older man that I got to know, was a wonderful teacher, taught me to pay attention to this line, where Jesus says, "Do you see this woman?" Think about that line. Do you see this woman? And this invitation from Jesus is that same sort of thing of, is it possible for you to cast a just and loving attention on this woman? Do you even see her? And this has been something that out of hearing people talk about that kind of stuff, I've tried to push myself to make sure that I'm not so full of myself and not so in a hurry that I don't see the people literally around me, right? Because it's very possible in our world to not see the people that are attending to us, that are working for us and for our community, that are doing the kinds of things that we desperately need done, right? And so this word from Jesus, do you see this woman? And again, to Myers Murdoch, the essential moral act to cast a just and loving attention. But how might we move then into this sort of seeing? Well, not just seeing then, but also hearing. There's a sort of necessity of hearing. That is, part of this is retooling our capacity for conversation. Now, I want to note, we've got several young folks here that really got our ears. And I think that one of the things that those of us who are older ought to always be paying attention to the fact is that younger people have a great weight on them that we did not have when we were younger. Namely, the distraction that comes with technology and the distraction that comes with social media and all of that stuff. And consequently, it is harder and harder for us to keep up and maintain certain basics of conversational skills because we're so distracted and we have such a weight with this sort of stuff. And so I'm increasingly watching my college students, a lot of them kind of come to college and they don't really know how to have conversations. And it's because that this cultural social weight of our devices that has become a sort of that separates us one from the other person, right? And so this sort of notion of taking seriously the importance of conversation is crucial. And with that, the old prayer attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, right, that begins, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." And you'll remember that there's that one line going down into the prayer that says, "Let us seek first to understand, then to be understood." So certainly with any kind of place of disagreement, I think this old wisdom from St. Francis is crucial, right? If I keep asking myself, have I taken the time to try to understand where you're coming from? Or am I rushing to get you to hear me, right? And the better we can do at this seeking first to understand, the more space it opens up for new possibilities between us. So we must learn to ask great questions. We must learn to be good conversationalists. We got to learn to be excellent conversationalists. I'm kind of introverted at a certain level, and so looking to engage people takes energy from me, requires energy of me. But one of the things I'm trying to push myself on, I've had other people teach me and push me on, is to always be trying to figure out how to do that better, right? This is a basic skill of living, is learning to be a good conversationalist. So here's the second guy, clip from David Brooks, talking about how to converse.
So I have to be really good at asking you questions and really good at having conversations. And so in the book, I have a bunch of conversational tips. How do you become a great conversationalist? And there are things like treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If I'm going to be in conversation with you, my attention will be 100% or zero. It's not going to be 60%. I'm not going to multitask and I'll be looking at my phone. Another one, there's a friend who you may know, a friend of mine named Andy Crouch.
Sure.
When you talk to Andy, it's like you're talking to a Pentecostal charismatic church. He's like, yes, I agree. That's good. Amen. Preach that. And so what I learned from Andy is be a loud listener. When somebody's talking to you, react. And you can either react verbally like Andy does, or if you go on TV and look at an Oprah interview and turn the sound off, you see her facial expressions are changing depending on what the person is saying. She's a loud listener because she's reflecting back to them all the different emotions they're going. And so that's another tip. Another tip is don't be a topper. If you say to me, oh, I had this terrible flight, I was on the tarmac for 2 hours, I might say, well, I know what you went through. I've been on a flight where we were sat on the tarmac for 4 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate, like we went through the same thing. But really what I'm saying is, A, let's stop talking about you. Let's talk about me. And B, my experience is way better than your experience. And so I'm being...
So, again, there's he does a lot more than these three in his book, and there's lots of places you can get them. We're going to go to another clip in just a second talking about conversation and the skills of conversation. But the main thing, first thing I want to point to is if you will set for yourself an agenda of saying, I want to continue to get better at this. I want to continue to get better at connecting with people, the kinds of questions I ask, by learning enough about human psychology to be able to connect with them. I think that it isn't something that you've done or thought very carefully about or intentionally about it. I think you'll be really shocked and surprised about how quickly you can make progress in connecting with people by simply taking seriously the agenda of connecting through conversation. Now, this first one has attention as an on-off switch. The thing that I shared at the table about the kind of weird, annoying thing about you, my weird annoying thing that I shared was that I stopped using a cell phone 7 years ago. Now that makes it very inconvenient sometimes, like when you're traveling in the special, it is quite inconvenient. So it's bothersome sometimes. But 7.5 years ago, I stopped. And one of the reasons I stopped was because I didn't like the kind of person I was as much with a phone. Right, so for example, I would be driving home and I would put my phone in the center console because I didn't want to be distracted by it. And I stopped at a stoplight and I immediately reach in there and start looking at my text messages. And then what's happening, the light changes and I don't know about text messages. So here I go, it's like, I don't know, live that kind of life. Now I think the chance of hurting somebody. And I also didn't like the fact that it just amped up my anxiety. And it made me distracted from the people that were around me. So I stopped using it. Now, I'm not a preacher about this. You get to decide if it's good for you or not, right? And a lot of people have to have cell phones in this day and age for the kind of work that they do, so forth and so on. So I'm not evangelizing about not using cell phone. My point is simply this. We live in an age in which we're distracted. And here he's going to say, if you want to connect with people, we've got to figure out a way to treat our attention as an on-off switch, right? If I'm with you, I'm with you. If you're with me, be with me. We all know it, right? You get spotted just like that when somebody's not with you. They're with you, but they're not with you. And I would even say, when you do go out and sit at a restaurant at the table with somebody, don't even put the phone on the table. Don't even put the phone on the table with it turned down. Even when it's on the table and it's turned down, it is a presence at the table. It's just a presence. Listen to this. My last Phantom Buzz in my pocket was 1 year after I stopped using the phone console. It's always there, right? It's in our wiring. So find ways, whatever it is, to try to set aside the distractions and learn to connect with people one-on-one. Note that all three of these things are about character. You can think of these things as strategy, as a way to manipulate people and connect with people, you know, gotta be slick kind of, you know what I'm saying. Yeah, but if you think of them instead as pointing to our character, ask yourself the question, what kind of person does this well? All right, that's the question. And so it's a connect with person because you care about connecting with the person. Give attention to the person because you care about giving attention to the person, right? Or you care enough about connecting with a person that you'll do the little bit of extra effort that it takes to be a loud listener. Or you will restrain your own ego and vanity long enough not to be a topper. Let them tell their story. You don't have to have a better story. Let them have a better story, right? That all of these things point to the kind of person that we are bringing to the conversation. So this next guest, Heather Hallman's a communication professor at University of Penn, and she's got this lovely conversation, lovely book entitled The 6 Conversations, Pathways to Connection in an Age of Isolation and Incivility. And I've been fascinated with how people have responded to this interview with her. And I've had colleagues who have heard her talk about this and have gone out and adopted the book for courses, right? Because it's so highly practical and helpful in helping us learn to converse well. But one of the first things that she does in this book is she asks us, what kind of person are you? What kind of person are you bringing to the conversation with another person? And here's her first commentary on that.
So I compiled what the 4 things you really need in order to love someone in conversation. And when I say them to you, Lee, you're going to think, oh, that's easy, that's basic. But listen, everyone needs to grow in these areas. I've never met one person who wouldn't want to grow in the art of conversation and loving connection. So the 4 mindsets are really simple. The research shows you have to believe the best about someone, be curious, express concern, and share your life.
As an academic, you know, we academics, we like ideas, right? And we care about words. And I think my first decade maybe out of graduate school, right, when they just, you know, what in many ways what a PhD program is like academic hazing. What they're doing is they're beating the mess out of you just to see if you can take it and then go out and be in the academic world, right? And so you care about ideas. And you care about the words people use to express their ideas. You just always, you know, the big old prefrontal cortex hanging off the top of our brain is just always on fire for the academics, right? And we think this is the only thing that matters. But one of the things I began to realize is that it didn't matter how good my rationality was, how good the workings of my prefrontal cortex was, how good my intellectual constructs were, that if I didn't learn to pay a little bit of attention to human psychology, I wasn't going to help anybody. And if I couldn't learn to laugh a little bit, tell some jokes, you know, make people lighten up a little bit, not be quite so serious, and don't preach so blasted long or lecture so blasted long, all of a sudden my ideas came alive for people where previously they might have fallen flat. And so the notion then of learning to pay attention to human psychology, I think, is crucial for us as we want to try to connect with people. I have this soapbox speech I give undergraduate students. I've lightened up in my older age of not being such a hard, you know what, in grading papers. But it used to be, I had the reputation on campus for quite a number of years that if you turned in a paper to me with a comma splice, you were going to get a C, right? Because it's like, college students ought to know better than using a blasted comma splice. Learn your grammar in high school and then come to college. Don't bring it to college. Your crappy grammar, don't bring it to college. You'll get I'm going to give you a C, right? So that was kind of how it was. And so inevitably, when I handed back the first batch of papers, you know, that in the semester, I'm handing them the paper bag, and you got all these C's that they're getting, and they're like, and then I would give them this soapbox speech, which I still believe is true. Even though I've lightened up on grading, I still think my soapbox speech is true. And I would say, listen, you and I both know that grammar is a social construct. There's nothing written in eternity about the rules of grammar. We made this stuff up. You and I both know that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I said, you can be the smartest guy or the smartest girl in the room and have the best ideas of anybody around you. But if you stand up in front of this classroom to tell us all about your ideas and you pick your nose while you're telling us, we don't listen to your ideas. And I said, that's why you have to have good grammar. Because if you don't have good grammar, they're going to think you're stupid. And your ideas won't matter. Now, what that has to do with this is this. If you won't pay attention to the basics of how people are wired, it doesn't matter how good your ideas are. They won't hear you. It's like you're picking your nose because you won't treat people like people are wired. So it's learning to treat people like people are wired that's crucial to all of this. And here, Heather points us to some of the ways that we are wired and some of the character traits that we want to try to cultivate so that we can interact with people in a way that honors who they are as people. Believe the best about them, right? You know, I mean, you've certainly had people who come at you kind of like a prosecutor as opposed to a friend. You know what that's like? You know, you get in an argument with somebody, and what they're doing is coming at you like you're on the stand, right? It's like, I don't care where you're coming from, what you're trying to do. You're trying to get me. And so I don't want to go with you when you're trying to get me, right? But instead, if we bring a posture in which we risk believing the best about someone, all of a sudden other possibilities open up. Or to be curious, right? Isn't it just a huge difference in your social encounters with somebody if you go to a party or something and they simply ask you a question about you? It just flitted through my head. A very dear friend I have, remember the first time our families had dinner together, this friend said, who was becoming a new friend, said, so Lee, what kind of stuff do you like to do that you have fun doing? It's a simple question, but here I am like 20 years later remembering them asking me that question, right? Because it was a simple act of curiosity, a sort of genuine question of curiosity. To express concern. And I would suggest on the express concern piece, if we'll especially try, if someone shares something emotionally sensitive or difficult or about some pain that they've experienced, try to find a way to circle back around it whenever the time's right. To try to acknowledge that, right? And sometimes it doesn't have to be a big deal, but it's something as simple as saying, wow, that must have been hard for you to go through that. Or it must be difficult for you to be going through this, right? Some sort of way to say, I heard what you said. That goes along with that seeing thing. I saw you when you said that, right? One of my colleagues that I work with, he's great at this. And he knows me well enough to know when I'm being courageous and putting myself out there, and he'll send me an email and he'll say, I saw you doing that, right? Or to share your life. You know when, if you have a relationship in which you're being vulnerable and sharing your own life, and you do it repeatedly, and the other person never does risk being vulnerable back with you, all of a sudden I'm like, at some point I'm backpedaling, right? Because it's like, there's not a reciprocity here, and this doesn't feel good. And it actually feels a little unsafe. Because what's going on? And so again, all of these things, these are the kinds of ways Heather says that we need to show up to a conversation. Now, next what she does is she provides this super helpful, I think, catalog of human experience, which gives you 6 ways immediately to get into connection or conversation with other people. So, catalog of human experience. Here she is on this.
So my husband said, look, just go down the 6 dimensions of what it means to be human, ask questions in one of 6 categories. And this is the day I started writing the book. I took out my pen. Every person you meet is social, physical, emotional, cognitive, meaning they have thoughts about things, volitional. A lot of people don't know that word. It means the choices that you are making, and you're spiritual. So if I'm meeting with someone, imagine, one of the stories that I have recently been telling people, it happened after the book came out. If you ask a person, how are you doing or how are you feeling? And they say they've had a hard time and they say, I just feel really bewildered. You have 6 options. You can say, I don't even know where to go next, but are you sharing with other people about that? Ask a social question. Or ask a physical question. How does that feel in your body? Especially when I'm dealing with people who are grieving, I'll say, where are you feeling that grief in your body? Or if I can't get someone to open up, I've learned that people really like to talk about their physical spaces. Like Lee, if you and I had a hard time connecting, I would say, oh, I really want to know about your house. Are you guys doing any house projects or gardening? Cognitive, easy. Just say, how are you making sense of that emotion? What is bewilderment? Volitional. What do you do when you feel bewildered? And believe it or not, that's what my friend wanted to talk about, the rituals she's putting into place when she feels bewildered, struggling in her faith. And the last one is obviously my favorite. Where are you experiencing God in this, or how is this experience impacting your faith? So you move through those dimensions of being human, and the book gives you my 10 favorite questions about how to start a conversation in that pathway and then how to follow up.
So I find that be a very helpful, quick snapshot of thinking about ways you can immediately connect with somebody. It was interesting that she skipped emotional, because that's actually become one of my favorites. And I think maybe it's become one of my favorites because I never did it until recent years. But it's like a quick in with a connection with another human being of saying, what's that like for you emotionally? How are you experiencing that emotionally? Now, again, with all of this stuff, you got to be careful. You can quickly begin to use these things and kind of manipulate, or you can ask yourself a question about, how am I showing up as a human being to try to be connected with another human being? And if you take it that second way, a lot of beautiful kind of stuff can come from that. The Mennonite theologian David Augsburger once said, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Isn't that beautiful? Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. So there's a vulnerability, as we've already begun to point to in all of this, that not merely seeing and hearing, that it's not simply sort of objectification, if you will, of the other person by seeing them and hearing them, but a vulnerability that has to take place in all of this. Which points us then to this third area of our toolbox, and that of responding, as I said a moment ago, rather than reacting. So that we began to pay attention to how we are responding. And as you're going to see in this next section, to think about all of the complexity that is going on in us and that may be going on in the other person, that if we don't pay attention to, we may never realize. And I have just found this so fascinating. And somebody like Kurt Thompson, Kurt's a psychiatrist who also does a lot of theology and moral philosophy kind of stuff. And what he's doing is he's pointing to the ways in which a lot of stuff is going on in our brains when we are encountering another person. A lot of stuff is happening when we are encountering other people. And so he helps us see, for example, what's going on in a relationship that's unacknowledged or unseen, but nonetheless is very powerful. I think one of the times I first really started paying attention to this was that our former university president had a lot of expertise in conflict management. He would teach conflict management courses in law schools and so forth. And when I would write sometimes on something that was very volatile, like for example, in that interfaith dialogue stuff, right? So a book I wrote during that time was on Christians and Muslims on war and peacemaking issues. And He actually didn't read the book when he was fussing at me, and later he read the book and said, I like that book. But anyway, I wish he had done that earlier. But anyway, I digress. But he would say, he said, Lee, when y'all talk about these volatile issues, he said, you're thinking it's just about the idea. And he said, but what they're teaching us in conflict management is you don't start with the ideas. You start with the brainstem. The brainstem is what makes people afraid. And if they don't know that they're safe, they will never get to the idea until they have felt safe in their brainstem. And then above the brainstem is the higher emotions, right? And so it's first fear, then the higher emotions that have to be dealt with, and then third, the ideas, right? Isn't that fascinating? So what a lot of us do, right, the academic types, and maybe you, we want to get to the ideas. We disagree about this idea. You got to get to the idea. And what they're saying is, no, you don't. Not yet. You got to deal with the fear. You got to deal with the emotions. And so this is what Kurt is pointing us to. So listen to what he has to say about this.
And so when we start to pay attention to things like my brainstem, this reptilian brain, and then my limbic circuitry, the part of my brain out of which emerges the things that I sense and feel, if you will, only then to move forward to my neocortex and especially my prefrontal cortex. If the more I pay attention to that, the more I start to be aware that so much of my life is actually my prefrontal cortex's work at regulating everything that is coming up from beneath it. I can imagine that it's easy for me to think that, what I think is really the essence of what is real in the world, without recognizing that the thoughts that I think are even ways for me to cope with and regulate all the things that I'm sensing and imaging and feeling long before in brain time, long before it ever gets to the thinking process. And so if I'm not paying attention, for instance, I'm having an argument with my wife, and I really think that it's about the thing we're talking about. Like the problem at the moment is the thing we're talking about, and I'm having the argument with the person that's standing, before me in the kitchen. And what I'm not recognizing is that in the first place, the biggest problem is the fact that I'm uncomfortable, literally, with what I'm feeling in my body as we talk about the thing, whatever the topic is. That's one thing. That, like, the problem at the moment is like my heart rate is up, my breathing rate is up, I'm feeling tense in my hands, I feel my voice raising. All these things are taking place at the levels of my brain that are far more like dogs and reptiles than they are like human beings.
Now think about that, all right? That last line, that's powerful, isn't it? There are things taking place at the level of my brain that are far more like dogs and reptiles than they are like human beings. That's not an insult. That's a neurological description of what's going on in the brain, right? There are different parts of the brain that have developed over evolutionary history, and the prefrontal cortex, where we think our ideas, is the more recent development, right? But that other stuff, that's older brain stuff. And he's saying when you're in conflict or disagreement or in an argument, all of that stuff is kicked up, right? And so it calls us then to learn to start paying attention to our bodies and to know that the other person on the other side probably has the same sort of stuff going on in their bodies, just like you have going on in your body, right? When I started learning to pay attention to this, I was just amazed, right? That to start realizing, I am so tight in my chest. And my adrenaline, I can tell my adrenaline's up because my fight or flight stuff is up and I want to run out of the room, right? And then by learning first to pay attention to the body, then you can start learning things to kind of calm those things, right? The psychologist, I don't want to get into this stuff because we've probably got some psychologists, psychiatrists in the room, right? But I think they call it arousal, right? You get aroused in your system and you want to go, fight or flight. But you can learn ways to calm that by breathing in certain ways, by laying down on your back and taking 4 deep breaths, by slowing your breathing rate to about one every, to reduce it, I think, to about, if you can reduce it to 6 breaths per minute, all of a sudden it brings all that stuff down. There's stuff that you can do, right? But a lot of times we're not even paying attention to that stuff at all. And instead it's gotten all stirred up, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's going to come out on somebody else. So it's first learning
to pay attention to ourselves. So now here in this next clip, Kurt talks about an example of a fight between a husband and wife, and how in this particular case, the husband, when they would get in this fight, he would, as soon as the fight would start, he would leave the house and get in his car and go away.
The couple's having the fight about things, and in the middle of the fight, he leaves the kitchen, goes out and gets in his car and takes off. And of course, this is not helpful for their relationship for him to just depart like this. But what neither of them are recognizing in the moment, that even though thinks he's arguing with his wife, what he's really doing is trying to regulate his anger that was a product of what would happen when his alcoholic father would come home and things would get dangerous in the house. And one of the ways that he coped, even as an 8 and 10-year-old, would be around the time his dad would be ready to come home from work, like he would get on his bicycle and take off, ride through the neighborhood. And then he would be called home for dinner. But it would give him a break before he would have to deal with his dad. And by the time he was 16, he would find himself, oddly enough, driving his car around. And so when he would have his fight with his wife, he doesn't recognize that it's his dad who's standing behind her, even though he's not in the room. But this is a way for people to remember things. So neurally, when people start to be introduced to the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm actually having memory that is coming into the room, that I'm not even aware that that's what's happening. When people are educated about this, they discover that being aware of the mechanics of the mind actually give them more tools to be able to pause, take a breath, and then also recognize, my goodness, I have a lot of unfinished business that has to do with my anxiety and my sadness and perhaps even my anger about my dad that is completely separate from my marriage. And if I'm actually willing to take that on and do that work, it changes my marriage.
And you hear what he said? I've got a lot of unfinished business to do. When I'm arguing, in another interview he said, that I did with him, he said, I don't know how the psychiatrist would measure this, or if he's just kind of talking out of his experience, but he said something like, 90% of the time that you're arguing with your spouse, you're not arguing with your spouse. You're arguing with your mother or your father. Isn't that interesting? And he says, if you'll take the time to do the work with this, it will improve your marriage. Bizarre situation, just in the last couple of weeks, I heard a family member who was very upset with another family member. And this person's, in his 60s now. And he brought up a situation with a parent that happened when he was 13, that he's been carrying around all these years, that was in the room in that argument between the two of them. So this is super helpful, I think. None of us like the fact that, we've got unfinished business. Who wants to deal with their unfinished business? Because it's hard work to go deal with your unfinished business. It can be very painful. But at least at a minimum, it allows us the opportunity to ask ourselves this question. When you are at loggerheads in a disagreement with somebody, is it possible that you have some unfinished business that you're bringing to that disagreement and that difficulty? Just ask yourself, is it possible? And if you'll allow the fact that there's a possibility there, and again, all the time, that may not be true all the time. I'm sure it's not true all the time. But at least to ask yourself the question, am I reacting to this person out of my own woundedness that I've not yet sufficiently healed in, right? Then that can, again, allow us space to try to work through some of these things. I mentioned that several years ago, after I'd done that interfaith dialogue lecture that got me on the front page of the paper, it did a lot of other things. It also got me being called by Fox News, and also got me that morning before I got to my 8 o'clock class, the local rap station in Nashville had a call-in survey and found me stupid by a wide margin. And then Fox News helpfully did a story later that week, and so forth and so on. But anyway, so I went off to write this book because I wanted to kind of dig more into this. And so I got to know this Muslim theologian in Jerusalem. And he's a very gentle, lovely human being. And I had meals with him several times, and he had meal at his home that was a beautiful spot overlooking the valley right at the Dome of the Rock, right outside his living room window. And one time that we met for lunch at the American Colony Hotel. For those of you who are hymn singers, the old hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." was written by the man that's founded this place as a commune in Jerusalem, and now it's a hotel, American Colony Hotel. So we were sitting in this beautiful courtyard having lunch, and we sat down, and it was one table for two, so we're close and tight. And he looked at me, I think right after we had ordered our meal, and he looked at me and he said, "Did you know that the Christians on the first crusade came in to this town above Jerusalem and they ate the Muslims?" Now, if I hadn't happened to have read a history book of the Crusades the day before, I would have thought he's crazy. But the day before, I was sitting in the library at this study institute right outside Bethlehem, and I came across this crazy story guess what? They never taught me this story in my church history class in seminary. I didn't know that story, had never heard that story, but he knew that story. And I think it's crucial for us to realize that all of us in some way are carrying around stories of traumas that other people don't know. We're carrying around stories of personal trauma. We're carrying around stories of familial trauma. We're carrying around stories of social trauma. We are carrying around stories of historic trauma. And those stories are with us. And those stories are in us. And they shape the way we react to other people. And if we can't make space to allow people to express those stories, then we can't get very far in having a relationship with them. And so it's crucial then that we work in opening up this sort of space. And we might not be able to get very far unless I first say, maybe the most important thing I can do at this moment of disagreement is work on my own stuff, right? And that interesting way to think about disagreement, right, is to say, and again, you have to decide for you whether the answer is yes, because disagreement takes lots of shape, lots of different places, lots of different particularities. But at least we ask ourselves the question, is there something about me that I need to work on? Because whatever it is that I have in my past that I'm bringing into the room may be damaging the possibility that we have to communicate with each other. That my own woundedness that's not sufficiently healed might be so palpable in the room that we can't get very far in our disagreement because of that trauma or because of that woundedness. Last one we're going to point to here is disagreeing. I'll hit this one quickly. The guests here were David French, New York Times opinion writer, and Kristen Dumais, author of Jesus and John Wayne. The reason we wanted to put these two together on a particular episode is because David is kind of like stereotypical white male political conservative, and Kristen is the great representative of critic of white male conservative Christians, right? And so I knew that she was going to be in town, and he lives in town, and I know both of them, so I thought, well, this would be interesting to put them in the same room and see what they do, right? And see how this goes. And it was fascinating because I didn't want them to talk about things that they might differ on. I wanted them to talk about the commonality of their experiences with people coming so hard at them and criticizing them. David, for example, in 2015, when he tweeted something about a prominent political person, it's not the one you're thinking about. He tweeted something, and he said within 10 minutes, he has one of his children, adopted children, is a person of color, and he said what happened within 10 minutes is that somebody put a photoshopped image of his child in a gas chamber with somebody about to click the button to gas his child. And they've had death threats to no end. They've had people listening in on their phone line at home. They've had to call the police repeated times. It's crazy land. It's crazy land. And so he knows what it's like to kind of get this sort of social hostility and to deal with death threats and hatred and hostility. And Kristen has that as well. The day we released this particular episode, it immediately shot higher than, to that point, any episode we had ever released. And I looked on social media, and I could not believe the ruthlessness of the way people talked about both of them. And I texted them the next morning, and I said, hey guys, as Laura and I were falling asleep last night, we prayed for y'all because I couldn't get over the kind of hatred and hostility that came out with that. And David texted back immediately, and he said, oh, I actually thought yesterday was pretty tame. So he's dealing with that kind of stuff all the time, right? And so we asked him to kind of talk about that kind of stuff. So here's one of the things that David said.
So again, I was having lunch with this SBC friend of mine, and he was just talking about the sheer number of flat out wrong things he hears about me. Yeah. And that grieves me. The idea that there's lots of people who just believe fundamentally false things about me is grievous to me. But the weird thing is the effort to address it could perversely do more harm than good.
Exactly.
Especially in a Twitter space.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said, if I've got it, once I figure it all out, I will tell you.
Yeah.
But I think the most hurtful thing actually when the threats really came rolling in 2015 and 2016 for the first time, our very close friends were very grieved with us and very hurt with us that this happened. But you move one layer out of that close friendship, and the next response was, well, don't let that turn you against Trump. And you're thinking, wait a minute, there's a human being here who's going through a really traumatic time with just a family. And whatever I've written, it's not my kid's fault,
Right.
you know? And one of your main responses is, well, oh, I can see that's going to turn you against Trump.
Yeah.
That's not how you interact with a human being in a morally healthy way. That's
Yeah.
when you've elevated politics to such a position that all other considerations start to fall away.
Yeah.
So here we have this sort of, again, reminding ourselves to pay attention to the humanity of the other person and asking ourselves, what are we allowing to trump everything else? What are we allowing to have the highest authority over everything else other than the humanity of the person in front of us? Now, the next topic that he points to is this sort of question of when I, as a community, are challenged of some sort of wrong that we've committed, right? Obviously, that happens oftentimes in disagreements, right? How do we respond to that? And he says there's two ways you can deal with that.
There's a couple of ways to go with that. One is to sort of say, my goodness, we have sinned, we have fallen short, and we need to repent of this. Another one is to say, well, no matter how bad we are, they're worse. And it seems to be people have walked through that door number two. No matter how bad we are, they're much worse. And so that's what I mean by the rally effect. And, you know, we're talking about a movement.
So here, this, again, with St. Francis, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And the hard work of saying, okay, in this disagreement or in this challenge that we're dealing with, the other person is saying, no, you've really screwed up, or your people have really screwed up. All right, and so our tendency, obviously, our self-justification is saying, well, they're worse. You're worse, right? Or you're really way worse, right? Then the question becomes, can we have the courage that it might take to say, actually, you're right. We really did mess up. Yeah, I really did mess up, right? And again, that's going to be crucial to trying to move ahead with this. Now, what Kristen does here is that she asks, we're asking her the question, what are kind of some practical things that you do in dealing with the feedback and the push that you're getting, which I found that.
And so maybe it was about a year ago that the attacks started coming a bit more. And, I treated them, I'm a historian, and I'm very comfortable with scholarly engagement. And so these were not really scholarly critiques,
Right.
but I responded to them as though they were. And so I just kept clarifying, talking about evidence, talking about historical methodology. When they would ask me questions about my faith, I would answer honestly. And I thought there's something to be just modeled there, that you don't have to play games. You don't have to, meet fire with fire. And so that's what I've been trying to model.
Now, I love this. This is what I've been trying to model. She says, this is a phrase I would invite you to write down and think on, and I don't know where I came across this line, but it's zero emotional reactivity. Zero emotional reactivity. And that's what I hear in Kristen there, right? Here she has people coming at her hard, coming at her with these sort of over-the-top critiques, and what's she doing? She's treating it like a scholarly conversation. Right, this detached objectivity about the conversation. Similarly, Katharine Hayhoe, I don't know if you know her, but Katharine's a leading climate scientist in the country, and I've had an interview with her twice, and she as well talks about the death threats that she gets regularly from people by doing climate science work. And when I ask her, how do you deal with this? She says, I treat it like data. And I'm like, what? And she says, I just treat it like data. She says, I know what the science says. I'm not threatened by what they have to say. And so when they this person comes at me this way, this person comes at me this way, I treat it like data because I'm learning something about what's going on in our culture or what's going on. So there's sort of capacity to try to cultivate some detachment and to see it in this kind of zero emotional reactivity way, again, opens up new sort of possibilities. That's as far as we can go on toolbox stuff. But hopefully you'll find some of those helpful, and I encourage you to ruminate on those and work with some of those, and we'll have time for you to talk about those at the table here in just a minute. I want to close with one last thing, kind of in my last comment, and that is that there was in the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul writing the book of Galatians, right? You have in the community of Galatia, this kind of rabid conflict. And it's between two parties. It's the circumcision party and the non-circumcision party. Now we're like, what? We're not thinking about that. I didn't think about that even with the nudist bike club today. And I could have, because I saw more than I wanted to see. But anyway, but in his context, that was everything. You take whatever hostile issue at hand that we're splitting over, this was as big or bigger. Circumcision, non-circumcision. And in Galatians, he says at one point, there's no longer a Jew or Greek, there's no longer a slave or free, there's no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. What he says to the partisans who are siding on this side or that side, he takes all of the big categories of distinction of his day, Jew and Greek, which is circumcision, non-circumcision, male and female, slave or free. Those are the big categories of division and parties between people of his day, right? And he says, if you're in Christ, you're one in Christ, right? So he's making this kind of theological claim that this theological commitment can trump division. Now, whether that's true or not, it remains to be seen for a lot of us Christians, right? In the way that this is causing, maybe our faith is causing more division than less. And that's something that we've got to deal with. But one of the things that he says is, right, in a context in which you have anyone who's going to argue A, the natural tendency is for the other person to argue not A. And the longer and harder this person argues A, this person argues not A, right? So here he is dealing with people, he's dealing with the circumcision party that he believes to be fundamentally wrong. But what would you expect him to say? Not circumcision. And that is precisely what he does not do. Or what he does is he says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. In chapter 5, and then the next chapter, in chapter 6, in case you didn't catch it, he says it again. For neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything. Isn't that fascinating? So it's how do we take seriously a seeking to reframe those things that divide us and alienate us and try to find, without asking you to give up your convictions and you asking me to give up my convictions, that we treat others as human beings and find some sort of way forward in the midst of that difference, bridging the chasm where we still may have our differences, but we have found some sort of way to have communion with each other. We have found some sort of way to work together. We have found some sort of way to travel one to the other and have some sort of space of a new possibility of common ground that can be beautiful and that can be lovely. Thank you.